Hello everyone, Time to Grind here, and today I wanted to talk a lot about a question a lot of people ask themselves and ask a lot of game developers, and that's, do multiplayer games really need a campaign? And lately there have been a lot of multiplayer games coming out that just don't have campaigns or any story modes or anything, like games like Overwatch or Rainbow Six Siege. And obviously this mainly applies to specific genres of games like first-person shooters, but other genres like MOBAs with League of Legends or Dota, or card games like Hearthstone don't have main story modes. And most people don't tend to expect a campaign, a full-blown story mode from, free-to-play games, especially games kind of like MOBAs or Hearthstone. So why do people expect and, almost demand story modes from games like FPS games? And it's mainly, I think, for two main reasons. Firstly, almost all of the first, really mainstream first-person shooters were entirely, story-driven campaign experiences. Maybe not so much story, but they had a campaign, and that was just the whole entire game. There was no multiplayer. And, especially Call of Duty, one of the first main, really popular mainstream kind of franchises, all of the original Call of Duties were campaigns. And then they added multiplayer, and for the next couple CODs, multiplayer was there, it was popular, but it was still kind of a side thing. The campaign was still the main important part of Call of Duty. And now, kind of, as long as Call of Duty's been out, the fan base is getting COD for a very different reason. Obviously, there are people that are still buying Call of Duty for the campaign, but the main reason Call of Duty is made now is to make money, and they make the most money by focusing entirely on the multiplayer with just a little bit focus on the campaign, because they can't just drop the campaign. Firstly, because there are some people that do buy the game for the campaign, and also, it mainly is, in my opinion, there's been a campaign in every single Call of Duty. So if you release a campaign, or if you release a Call of Duty without a campaign and just the multiplayer, not only are you acknowledging the fact that that's just what COD is nowadays, it's just a bunch of, TDM, loot box type of stuff, which can be fun. I've enjoyed World War II a little bit. But you're kind of acknowledging that, and also it looks really, really bad, because that's what COD has come to. It no longer has all of its awesome story and campaign that it was once known for. It's kind of like that. So mainly just because the way first-person shooters kind of firstly became popularized, it was with these amazing campaigns, whether it was just an action, super action-based campaign that made you feel like you were in an action movie, or one that was, almost more story-driven. And I think the second main reason why people demand campaigns and multiplayer first-person shooters is just because of the fact that the first-person shooter genre encompasses so much. There's so many different types of games and subgenres within the first-person shooter genre. I mean, you can have, extremely first-person shooter games that are almost entirely focused on delivering a story. You can have a first-person shooter that has so many, RPG elements that it's, like Borderlands, that's a first-person shooter, but it's also nothing like Call of Duty, which is also a first-person shooter. So when you have just this huge encompassing term of first-person shooter, you start to expect things that you probably shouldn't expect. Because if you start playing a single type of first-person shooter a lot, especially because most games have a campaign, most games have a type of single-player experience, and then it's kind of, nowadays especially, people are trying to get more multiplayer games because of the whole games as a service, and try to extend the lifespan of games, and, try to make as much money as you can from a game. So people are tending to be more on the multiplayer side, but most games still are, single-player campaign, experiences. And whether it's a very interesting story-based narrative or it's just a really action-based thing, they still have a campaign of some sort, whether they call it that or not. And when most first-person shooters have a campaign, because, Borderlands, it has a campaign because that's what the game is. The game is, it does have a story, there's quests. You go through that because that's the entire game. Another game like first-person shooter that might be a horror game. The entire point of the game might be to try to, it might be single-player, and you might be trying to, escape the forest in Slenderman by getting all the pages and everything like that. That's not really a campaign, in the sense of the original, terms of campaign, but it's still a single player experience that people kind of are starting to expect from multiplayer games. Because a game like Overwatch or TF2 or Rainbow Six Siege, that's an entirely different type of, first-person shooter as a game like Borderlands, or a game like Slenderman's not really a first-person shooter because there's no shooting in it, but there are horror games like it that are first-person shooters. And because there's so many different types of genres, when you have a game like CSGO or Rainbow Six Siege or Overwatch or things like that that are more multiplayer competitive based, a lot of people are so used to first-person shooters having a campaign or a story mode, especially going back to what Call of Duty did, back then and still does now, that if there's not a campaign, they freak out a little bit. Even though, a lot of people will be like, oh, I'm not spending $60 on a multiplayer-only experience. I need a campaign in order to get my $60 worth. And that, and it's entirely, that argument to me just makes no sense, because you can get 5 to 10 hours of insane enjoyment from a campaign, and that's $60. There you go. Or you could have a multiplayer game that could have thousands and thousands of hours that cost $60. So in terms of kind of hour per dollar, I guess, obviously multiplayer games have more value. But the thing is you can't just go hard and soft, or hard and fast on that rule, because there are some single player games that I have played. I've played some walking simulator games that only last like 2 hours, but the story and the way they tell the story is so enthralling. I think I would pay even more for that. Games like Stanley Parable, that game's amazing. The same guy made a game called The Beginner's Guide, and that's honestly one of my favorite games of all time. Even though it's just a walking simulator, but the story is so good, even though it only takes an hour or two to beat, I would have spent a lot more money on it than I did, even though I got, an hour or two out of enjoyment. So obviously, there's exceptions to the rule, but when people are saying they won't spend $60 for a multiplayer exclusive game because they want just, a campaign, that's why developers make these crappy campaigns that only last 3 hours and they're terrible, because if they don't have a campaign, people will flip out. And also, especially for Call of Duty, I don't know if this happens too much, but I definitely feel like it does. A lot of times, the campaign is what is mainly used in trailers, because if you have, just a bunch of people running around a map killing each other, that doesn't look as awesome as a tank hitting a ship and it, flips around in the air, and, all these explosions and all these characters are screaming and horror and stuff like that. That obviously doesn't seem as enticing as just someone running around a map with a shotgun and just insta-killing people. As much as when a multiplayer game comes out, everyone wants the gameplay or, the multiplayer trailer because they want to know what the game actually looks like. But for the vast majority of people, they see, oh, that game looks really exciting, because of all the story mode stuff. So it's also used a little bit for that. But overall, I think the main reason, I've given a lot of the reasons, but I think one of the main reason why a lot of people expect multiplayer games to have, especially first-person shooters, to have campaigns is because that's what they know. With games that they've played before, they're like, oh, well, this first-person shooter, all the first-person shooters I've played before now have had campaigns, so because you're making a game that doesn't have a campaign, that's not as valuable as all the games I've bought previously. You're doing a worse job than the games I've previously bought. And that's not necessarily true at all. Although it would be nice for, a game to have a campaign, especially if you really like it. Like, I think it'd be awesome if Overwatch just had a full-fledged story mode campaign. I think it'd be awesome if Rainbow Six Siege has, had a full-on campaign. I think that would be really, really great. But the fact is, it's simple as if you're making a story mode, you're having to cut somewhere else. So if you're saying 100% of the development time of a game and 100% of the funds are going to the multiplayer, that multiplayer is going to be so much better than if you only spend, say, 60% of all your funds and time and workload and, your people that can work on the game on the multiplayer, the main part of the game, and then you waste 40% of all of that on a campaign that most people won't even open up or touch, and just kind of doesn't really matter after people have played it. Because especially a game, that try to do this games as service and they try to stay alive as long as possible and make as much money as possible, the only way they're really doing that is through, multiplayer. Because especially really competitive games. It's why esports, a lot of games really push for esports, because if a game is an esport and it's constantly getting updated, it's going to have an extremely long lifespan. You know, CSGO is still going on. TF2, obviously, it's a very different, very different case, very different exception, but that game's still going on. And TF2 doesn't have a story mode or anything like that. And I think people just expect it because that's what's come before. But ultimately, if you're the type of game that you're trying to make a multiplayer experience, and you're just trying to make that the core gameplay, you do not, in my opinion, need a campaign at all. And I will spend $60 on your game if your game is $60 worth of value. I'm not saying just because you're a multiplayer game and you don't have a campaign, if your game still sucks, I'm not going to spend $60 on it, obviously. But I'm personally not feeling like I am getting gypped for buying a, you know, multiplayer only game. I don't need a story mode that's going to be either rushed or take away from the main game. And especially if you're a really big fan of, say, you know, Overwatch, and you love multiplayer, you play it every day with your friends and stuff like that. And if you're one of the people that are also just really demanding a story mode, what you're pretty much saying, kind of behind the scenes, is you're wanting less work to be done on the multiplayer. You're wanting you want the multiplayer to overall be worse, because of the fact that if they're needing to now put a lot of work and money into a story mode, they have to take it away from somewhere. That money just doesn't appear out of nowhere. You know, people can't just work without not working on something that they were doing before. So the multiplayer is going to suffer. So I think if you're making a game for the ultimate purpose of just being a very good multiplayer game, multiplayer experience, all of your time should be spent into that multiplayer. Now, does that mean if a developer really wants to also have a campaign, they can't? No. But if their main goal is to make the multiplayer as great as it can be, you don't need a story mode, in my opinion. But obviously, that's just my opinion. That's what's so great about being human, is we all have different opinions on the subject and everything like that. So if you have a different opinion, or, you know, whatever, let me know in the comments down below. I love talking with you guys. I love hearing your guys' opinions and everything. And like always, guys, if you enjoyed this video, then consider leaving a like down below and subscribing to see more content and news. Also, if you don't know, I just started streaming since I moved into my new apartment. I'm still trying to work out a schedule, but overall, probably 3 or 4 days a week, I'll start streaming around 7 p.m. Central Time. So that's awesome if you want to watch me play, you know, video games like you do on Twitch. But anyways, guys, I hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and see you guys next time.